Hey guys, this is Justin with Shock Therapy, and we are here today to show you how to install a dual rate spring kit on a Honda 4-seater with live valve shocks. This dual rate spring kit is going to remove a lot of the stiffness and rough riding qualities that are prevalent in the Honda 4-seater. As always, our springs are made in the USA and they are warrantied for life. It will eliminate some of the rear bucking as well as harshness in the system. When it comes to improving the suspension and ride quality of your Honda, a spring kit is one of the first things that we recommend that you start with. This spring kit is very easy to install. It should only take about 2 hours. So with that being said, we're going to turn this over to Mitch and he'll show us how to install this kit.
Hey guys, it's Mitch from Shock Therapy, lead technician. We're going to jump into the install on the Honda Talon today. It should be relatively easy. Should only take you about 2 to 3 hours. Let's do it.
First step, jack up the car to where the tires are just off the ground. Remove the hood to get access to the top of the shocks. Unplug the loom from the shocks. Next, loosen the hardware holding the shock to the car and remove the shock. We recommend that you do one side at a time to make sure that the correct shock stays on the correct side. Put the shock in the spring compressor and remove the tension from the lower spring perch. Remove the retaining clip from the bottom of the shock eyelet. Now you can remove the lower spring perch. Remove the factory springs and spring divider. With the shock in the vise, you can break loose the factory preload collars. Set the new preload measurement to 2 1/4 inches. Set your crossover ring measurement to 4 1/2 inches. You can now lock all the rings in place. Install the upper spring first that comes in the spring kit. Next, install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the bottom of the shock. Now install the lower spring. Make sure that the ends of the springs are touching the spring divider on the opposite sides from each other. This keeps the spring divider as straight as possible and eliminates rubbing. Compress the springs and install the lower spring perch. Don't forget to install the lower spring perch retaining clip.
It's easy just to kind of walk this on.
Release pressure slowly so that you line up the spring perch on the clip perfectly. Now you can install the shock back on the vehicle. It's a good idea to leave the hardware loose at this time. Later on in the installation, we're going to check ride heights. It's easiest to remove the shock from the car when changing your ride heights. Now repeat all the steps on the opposite front shock.
Push the rubber snubber down too before you do that.
both front shocks installed on the front of the car, don't forget to plug in the factory shock loom. You can put the front of the car back on the ground and jack up the rear of the car until the tires are just off the ground. Unplug the loom from the shock and then loosen the factory hardware. Remove one shock at a time. Remove the shock from the vehicle. Push the factory bump stop down the shaft to allow enough room to remove the spring perch. With tension removed from the spring package, you can remove the factory lower spring perch retaining clip. With the spring clip removed, you can now remove the lower spring perch with rock guard attached. Remove the factory springs and spring divider. With the shock and the vise, you can loosen the factory preload collars. Set your preload collars to 2 3/4 inches. Set your crossover rings to 5 3/4 inches. You can now tighten the preload collars and crossover rings.
Okay.
Install the upper spring first, then install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the bottom of the shock. Install the lower spring, making sure that the ends of the springs touch the spring divider on opposite sides.
Okay.
You can now install the lower spring perch with the rock guard. There is a line-up pin on that lower spring perch that will line up with an indent in the lower loop of the shock. This is there to keep the rock guard in line once it's installed on the vehicle. Install the spring perch retainer clip. Remove tension on the spring kit slowly so that you can line up the lower spring perch with the indent in the lower loop. Install the shock back onto the vehicle. Leave the hardware loose so that you can adjust ride heights easier later on in the installation.
Fucking retard. Make sure you plug your shock back in.
Don't forget to plug the factory wire loom back into the shock. Repeat these steps on the opposite rear shock.
Do the hump, the hump. Keep doing the hump, the hump. Love you, Loom.
Once both rear shocks are back on the car and the looms are plugged into them, you can lower the car back on the ground. It's now time to settle the suspension. You can't do this by jumping up and down on the car. You must drive it around the block, or at least back and forth a few times to settle it properly. Keep in mind, if you're trying to settle the car and the shocks are extremely stiff, this would be because you did not plug in the factory loom to that shock. Make sure that they're plugged in or the shocks will not function properly. Once you've settled the suspension, make sure that you come to a stop for the final time without hitting the brakes. With the driver remaining in the car, check the ground clearance measurement in the front. This is checked from the ground up to the bottom of the chassis at the lower control arm rear bushing mount. Ride height in the front with stock tires should be approximately 14 inches. Ride height in the rear of the car should be checked from the ground to the bottom of the frame in the center. Ride height should be set approximately 13.5 inches. Once you have set the ride height correctly, then you can check the crossover ring location. In the front of the car should be approximately 1.5 inches. In the rear of the car, the gap between the crossover ring and plastic divider should be approximately 2.5 inches. The reason that we leave the hardware loose is for you to adjust the ride height in an easier way. If the ride height has to be adjusted up or down, we found it easier to remove the shock from the car, set the preload on the spring compressor, and install the shock again. With all of your measurements correct, you can now tighten all the hardware on the car. Double check that all of the looms are plugged back into the shocks. Once the hardware is tightened, you can put the hood back on the vehicle and your installation is now done. Thank you, Mitch, for showing us how to install that kit, and we hope that your installation went as easy as it did for Mitch. As we always recommend, take the time to adjust your ride height when doing the spring kit. It's very important to the function of the kit that your ride heights are accurate. Also, our springs are brand new and they will take a set one time over the first 1 to 200 miles of driving your car. After that 200-mile period, measure your ride heights once again and adjust accordingly. After this, the springs will not settle again unless you add accessories to the car, so always keep in mind as you add more things to the car, the ride height will go down, so adjust it accordingly. If you like the improvement in your suspension and ride quality that this spring kit gives you, there's even more available once you get inside the shock. Look into our ride improvement system, which is internal shock modifications, if you like to get the absolute best out of your ride potential in your Honda. For more great products for your Honda, visit us at shocktherapist.com or give us a call at 623-217-4959.
Bacon and eggs, not on set.
I'm hungry, man.
This guy poops and then eats eggs and bacon as he's walking back from the bathroom.
Yeah, it's delicious. And nutritious. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. I don't know the rest of it.
All of Humpty's and all of Humpty's man. Couldn't put Humpty's dumb bro better together again.
Together again.
Unlike Brandon, pull out.
Like a rock stone cowboy.